We may as well start. Give us a bit more time. My name is Benjamin Mitchell. I'm an independent consultant. I've worked with Kanban teams for about 5 years. I've worked as an agile coach, a consultant. Currently, I'm having the best time I've ever had in my life at work at bbc.com. So it's with BBC Worldwide. We basically take BBC content and slap banner ads on it, which is both worthy and then dirty at the same time. But the purpose is to give money back to the BBC so that you don't have to pay as much in your license fee, which is a worthy thing because the BBC is unbelievably great from my point of view. So I'm applying a lot of this stuff in my work there, but I wanted to share some experiences, and particularly experiences where I didn't do so well, where I followed advice that I got and ended up being unsuccessful. And part of the talk I want to go through is to challenge some of the advice that we're given and point out where I think it is inconsistent. And I will use specific examples and name people's names because I believe it's important that I used evidence that you could test for yourselves. You may come to a different conclusion than I do, and I'm interested to find that out. I'm not trying to pull the wool over your eyes, but I realize that can be a bit threatening. My intention isn't to threaten or to criticize these people. It is my intention to challenge their ideas and to highlight inconsistencies. And I'll also do the same to my own behavior. Just to be clear, I'm not up here to annihilate people that give advice. I do want to highlight where I think it's inconsistent and ineffective. So with that, Kanban's, humans, and double loop learning. One of the things I was saying is the advice, I didn't do very well, and a part of me initially blamed the advice, and I went back and looked at the advice, and a lot of advice I think contains mixed messages. It says two things at the same time. So managers can impose rules on the team, but just not too many. It's like, what's the right number? How would I know? How would I work that out? Some of it's just very abstract. I mean, David's going to be here later. I find this, I don't understand what this looks like in practice. My goal is to change the self-image and social group fabric as the means to ensure institutionalization of changes. The question for me that I'd like you to ask is, what would you do or say to implement this? What is it? Indeed, and then could I tell you, I'm here to change your self-image and the social fabric around you? Or do I have to keep that hidden? Because I'd find that a bit weird if I heard that. In fact, I might even find that threatening. That might make me resistant, because I don't want my self-image or whatever the social fabric is changed, unless it was to be washed or something. I don't know. What is a social fabric? And then exercise control. Okay, so control is a good thing, but do it in a way that's subtle and indirect. So on the one hand, we have the idea that control is good. And on the other hand, you can't tell someone that you're doing it, and you can't let it be known that that is what's happening.
This one is simple. This is like your wife is telling you something. And then you come across it at the end and think it's yours.
So from the floor, we have an excellent demonstration of my thesis, which is we understand this inherently. You used an example about how you've interacted with your wife. That is brilliant because I think we get that this happens, but what we don't see in agile advice or Kanban advice is advice that takes that into account. So we hear things like be transparency. Transparency creates trust. But we know that when we're in threatening or difficult situations, we'll often hide what we're doing. And I don't hear anything in the advice that says humans will do this. Expect humans to do this, and here's how to work with it or minimize those conditions. So I thank you for that example, and I want to build on that point. So I wanted to start with an example from my own experience where I hadn't done Agile. I'd talked to people at the Extreme Tuesday Club for about 5 years. I always wanted to get into an Agile team, and then when I went to a bank that was the best place I thought that did Agile, when I got there, everyone had left. And then I finally realized that maybe I'd have to create this team, that I couldn't join it, I'd have to run it, or create that space. And so this is me running a team. I got the role as project manager or Scrum Master and implemented Scrum. And I wanted to introduce this idea of people getting to choose what they worked on. So the team can be self-organizing, they can choose what they want to do. And this is an example where I think we can have the right ideals, but it's hard to implement these things in practice. So how do you implement allowing the team to choose what they want to do? We had a planning meeting like in Scrum, and I just said, well, you guys are self-organizing, choose what you want to do. And one of them in particular really enjoyed choosing difficult, hard problems. And so every sprint, we had a couple in a row. He would pick 2 or 3 really hard problems. Then we'd have the stand-up during the sprint. We'd say, how are you going? Yeah, I've been busy, I promise to be busy tomorrow, no problems. You know, that sort of repetitive stand-up question and answer. We get to the end of the sprint though, and we'd say, well, how are you going on those things that you selected that you wanted to do? And he's like, yeah, not so good. Didn't get 2 of them done. And we're like, what? You didn't get 2 of them done? He goes, well, I was hoping to, but it just never happened. And so we realized that the advice was simple. People could choose what they want, but I'd implemented it in a naive way. In that stage, as a batch, they were allowed to choose a batch of things to do. So we changed it and said, you can choose whatever you want to do. And we started visualizing things because we weren't as clear as we became that he was basically hoarding problems that he enjoyed working on. So we made it visual and then applied the rule and said, you can choose what you want to work on, but you can only have one thing at a time. You can't have a queue. You can only reserve one. And so it's an example where I guess visualization helped, and where I thought the advice that I'd read wasn't very helpful. The idea of allowing a team to self-organize didn't give me enough information to know how to be effective, what to avoid. I wanted to tell a quick story. I got this from a book, Mike Cohen, talking about, so let's go back to the advice. What does the advice say about self-organization? So you notice that one of the team members, Jeff, is domineering and no one is willing to stand up to him. The team has self-organized. It has chosen to let Jeff make all the key decisions. As the Scrum Master for the team, you recognize that if this is allowed to continue, the team's efforts to improve will be impeded. So you consider having a private conversation with Jeff, but that's unlikely to change much. You contemplate stepping in and overruling some decisions he makes, but if you do it once, the team will continue to do so, which won't be good. What I love about this is later in the same article, he says the thing that's important with Scrum is that you can't predict the outcomes of the interventions that you make. And the challenge I've got is I'm thinking he's made some pretty strong predictions here about how other people will act. That he's decided if you have a private conversation with Jeff, that won't change much. And he doesn't give any reasoning why, and I don't see him having the conversation. So I think he's basically predicted, which he warns us later you can't do in Scrum. You can't predict the outcome. And yet I see him doing it with Jeff and also with the team. But he doesn't do that. And then what I'm claiming is happening here is that this is very human. He's coming up with logic, but using a test of logic, which is to effectively ask himself, what do I think others will do? And think that that's a valid test of others' behavior. So you begin thinking about the agile principles of subtle control and influence, which I missed the first time I read the manifesto, and I've read it again. I still can't see them. But he does make an interesting point. I mean, we do need to own up to the fact that control and influence are part of what we do. So I like that he's making it discussable. But I don't like the action. You decide to change the team's dynamic by asking management to add someone new to the Agile team, someone who is likely to stand up to Jeff. And in his article, he suggests adding an architect. I got the same laugh last time I did this talk. I don't know why that's funny, but I'm guessing many people have seen an architect added. So the problem is not that he's seen things that are going wrong in the team. It's this naive idea of what does self-organization mean. Like, it's almost as if the rule is, if you see a team acting ineffectively, don't tell them that, okay? Don't test what you see to see how they see it. Come up in your own head with solutions about what you could do. Test them by wondering how would they work in terms of how would other people think or act. And then act if you're not doing any of this. I think that's very ineffective advice because, like, on the one hand, we have Scrum saying transparency and openness are the keys to this. Yet on the other hand, I see his evaluation of the team's performance, you're ineffective. His prediction about changes, you would become dependent or you wouldn't be persuaded by a conversation. His test of logic with both of those is private, and he keeps that private and doesn't say that he's keeping it private. So it's not clear to me how that is consistent with transparency and openness. But it's very consistent with how I think we know humans can act. This is potentially how we can act.
When you have different opinions, you don't have to express this opinion. Because sometimes when you have people from views, this is adding to the negative in the dynamic. So transparency is visibility of every single action, not openness on every level. Because you made it yourself, change your mind in 2 days' time, and you are searching for 2 days ago, it's only comment.
There may be too much for me in what you've said for me to respond to right now, but I don't understand the rules that you're applying that on the one hand say be open, but hide some of your thinking because in 2 days' time you might be wrong.
We're not talking about openness and stuff. We're talking about transparency, visibility.
I don't understand the difference between transparency and openness.
Well, any individual, especially grown-ups, have this tendency that they don't say truth up front. And this is our going right, that we can't keep stuff to ourselves. And even now that we can do that, you don't do the practice of this life.
So you're saying as adults, we all have the opportunity to keep secret what we're thinking and not tell others that we're either keeping things secret or what we're thinking. Well, I mean, I think that's fine. But what I've not seen, and maybe you could point me to it in the literature, is where it describes is quite. I mean, it seems like you have a view on what the.
If I see someone that's not a fail, okay, I like to use a case, unit test or use a story with content, and I prove it wrong. And this is my transparent behavior. This is fact of life. I created a code that contradicts your assertion, yeah, and that's transparency. When I just have opinion that maybe both thinking is not right, this is just my opinion. I shouldn't even be voicing that unless I'm asked.
Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to leave it. But I think the thing is that if you make an action like add someone to a self-organizing team and you don't say why you're doing it, and you don't say that you're keeping your reasons private and that you haven't tested your reasons, I don't see that as consistent with transparency or openness. And that's what's interesting. Like I looked at a video that Mike put up to find out, because again, back to this advice, that the takeaway I want you to have is when you hear advice, think about what would I say or do to implement this? Because I'm thinking, what would you do if the team said, why did you add someone to the team? And in a video session on this, he says, I don't want to act in a way that's sneaky, deceptive, or manipulative. But if the team asked me why I added the person, I wouldn't tell them because they would become angry and defensive. But if they did ask in 3 years, I'd say, well, I judged you to have an ineffective decision-making style, and you came to some snap judgments. You needed someone with a bit more balance, so I added the architect. And so again, I'm still, the advice is lacking to me. It says do things, but if someone said, I still don't know what Mike would tell me I should say in that situation. My inference is I shouldn't say what I'm doing and I should keep secret my intention. And it's not, I don't understand how that generates trust.
This is a well-known pattern of thinking called post-operationalization. So he's arrived at a decision that he's made, and he is then backtracking in order to create the reasons why he's made the decision. But unfortunately, he's created what are inconsistencies in his own arguments, creating that rationalization of why it is that he made the decision. He made the decision based on a gut instinct, probably, which was, you know what, I could speak to Jeff, but I've spoken to Jeff about other stuff before, and usually Jeff's not actually terribly receptive about this kind of thing. So you're right, he's predicted, and he's chosen a course of action because he's already done that kind of min-maxing graph reversal thing, trying to figure out which is the most effective course of action. And he's made an arbitrary decision based upon his own worldview, and then when asked, he's created the backstory of why it is that he made the decision, so he appears to be rational. We all do this to some extent or other.
Even if your decision is completely silly, because you take a view that, being self-governing, yes, but we still have business objectives to fulfill. And if we don't deliver, this is actually the whole thing's fault, right? So I faced a situation in the past where I had to put really talented guy, really good guy, in a whole garden to keep him apart from the rest of the team, keep him busy with some really inventive tasks, because he was the director of the team.
Okay, all right.
I really appreciate that. Would you keep on the
Okay, all right, okay. All right. Well, I'll manage the audience's expectations then and be responsible for keeping us on track. I guess my point with this was really, if you think that someone is ineffective or the team's making a wrong decision, say what you see and say so. And so you say, I think you've made this decision, I think it's ineffective, here's why. I want to understand how you see it. Okay, and I want to try and work out how we could test this out between us. Okay? Rather than coming to a view on your own. And definitely, I think if you have to hide the reasons why you're doing something, I think that is deceptive. Now, we may have a discussion, but maybe we can produce trust through deceptive means. That would be a very interesting scenario for me to consider. But I think that there are these gaps and inconsistencies in the Agile advice. And again, I'm left not knowing what I should say if I was to implement this advice, add an architect, and if the team asked me what I was doing, how could I handle that? So I wanted to give an example of how I realized I was acting like this. I wanted to do Scrum in this organization. Someone had told me the CTO hated Agile because a program had gone unsuccessfully, but I thought it would be the right way to deliver the project. So I was in this bind, but I thought, what I'll try and do is not make it obvious that we're doing Agile. And so, curiously now, looking back, I thought I was hiding that. But what we used to do is 12 of us used to go to the fire escape at 5:15 every evening on a floor of 400 where no one ever left their desks. You know, looking back, it couldn't have been more obvious unless we'd had a flashing sign. And the thing was, because the board was small, so we could put it under desks. But it was weird because my logic was, I think this will achieve effective results. And I did tell my direct manager, but I just never, ever deliberately brought it up with the CTO because I didn't want him to cancel the thing that I wanted to do. But in my head, I was really hoping that at the end of it, he'd sort of say, oh, Benjamin, I loved what you achieved. You know, seeing as you achieved such great results, could you do it in other places too? But I was, and looking back, I'm thinking, but my logic was I deliberately thought you didn't like something, so I deliberately worked around that, hid the fact I was working around it, and tried to keep the whole thing secret and hope that the ends would justify the means. And the sort of the joke on this, in a sense, or the missed opportunity for learning, which is a better way of saying it, was that after I'd resigned, because I got quite burnt out in this scenario, after I resigned, he called me up and said, oh, we're running this transformation program. Would you like to be involved? And I said, but I thought you hated all of this. And he said, why? And I said, well, someone told me. And he goes, why didn't you talk to me? And I'm like, because you look scary. And he's like, I find it really interesting. You know, the question for me, Benjamin, is what are the other 400 on the floor doing? I like the fact you guys get up and talk about it. It's made me wonder, how do the others know what's going on? So the shame of it for me was that if we had had a conversation, it might have threatened my chance to do exactly what I wanted. Okay, but it might have given me an opportunity to negotiate with him to try some things that would have helped both of us learn. You know, in the end, I spent 2 years achieving successful results, I would argue, and he found it interesting, but I'd missed an opportunity because I'd acted on assumptions about how he saw the world. I didn't test them with him directly. So whilst I had a good intent and wanted to achieve a good outcome, I acted in ways that minimized the opportunity for me and him to learn. And I think that's the sort of the human tragedy, I think, in some of these gaps in the advice. The other thing was, people talk about transparency as if there's sort of transparency in the sense that there's a sort of a very over-optimistic, positive view of humans, that if we just make things transparent, things will sort themselves out. We use data. Data in particular will lead to good decisions. This is a graph of all the financial products we did in this investment bank across 750 work days that I was involved in the project. And using this lean idea of looking at end to end, the orange area is how long we spent developing it. The green is how long it sat waiting for the first user to try it. And they were financial products, so you needed to request a price and then book it. And so the booking is in pink, and the ones with black, and there are 16, I think, out of the 24 that are in black, were ever actually traded. And there are 8, and you can see here, this like, just make things visible and good decisions will come. I spent hours picking this color to highlight the fact that 8 of the products that we'd made had sat for hundreds of days without ever actually being used. Now the thing was, I was very frustrated, and I'm telling this example because I want to relate how we can think we're doing the right thing, but how we talk and handle things makes a big difference. Because I was sort of saying that this was a toxic political environment, but I think my own behavior and the anger that I didn't deal with very well contributed. And I found this advice from a theorist, a guy, a retired professor from Harvard called Idris. And he said, people blame others in the system, denying personal responsibility and denying their denying. And to make it clear, one of the tools he talks about is to write down what we said on one side of the page, like a script, and on the other side, write what we thought but didn't say. And this is basically what I said when I presented that graph to the steering committee. I said, and I thought, on my left-hand side, what I thought but did not say, what we're doing is crazy. It makes no sense to me, the product selection. But I thought, use humor so I don't offend them. Ease in, don't make them feel bad. And so I said jokingly, I think this may be the best graph I've ever done. And then I explained it as I explained it to you, except I didn't say I'd colored the red bit to highlight how shit they were. That was the bit I omitted. But it was in my left-hand column, right? You could kind of, you knew, here I'm acknowledging that I said it. I said, I thought it might be interesting to review it here. And the sponsor said, this graph shows how well the technical team has done and how badly we've made business decisions. And then everybody laughed. And I thought, oh, crikey, they feel criticized. I better stop. And then it looks like now we'll never really know how to address it. And so the thing was, I think if I look back on my own behavior, I hid what I was thinking. I framed it in a way that said I was right. I saw the truth. You guys are literally crazy. I thought that that wouldn't come through. I could be polite about it. But I get from his response, he understood exactly what I was thinking, but not admitting to. And then I make predictions about how they're feeling that I don't test. They feel criticized. And then I come to a judgment about we'll never address the point, but I don't say so. And also in my question, I thought it might be interesting to review it here. I'm not really being honest. Actually, I'm asking them, I'd ideally like to ask them for help. How are they viewing this that makes sense to them? Because I'm feeling frustrated continuing to develop products that don't seem to get the use that I'd expect, but I want to understand it better. And so the thing was, I think the way I said things meant that it reduced the chance for me or them to learn. But I wasn't aware of this gap. It took me a long time to see this gap that between how we say and what we're thinking. And if the two aren't congruent, they often don't produce good results. So people are all for the truth, as long as the truth is not embarrassing or threatening. This is a core thing to me, especially with Agile and Kanban and Lean. You know, we talk about humans being very important. I think this is pretty much a core fundamental truth of people, that if we feel that we're likely to be embarrassed or threatened, or you may be, and we predict that, we're going to act differently than we would otherwise. What we'll tend to do is to cover things up, bypass them, and pretend that we're not doing it, exactly like you saw me do in that example. So my example is, you know, if your partner asks, does my ass look big in this, we kind of know that there's something going on. You know, it's a very brave person that just gives an accurate response to that question. We know that something's coming up, that they're feeling embarrassed or threatened. They might want to feel better about themselves, but they're afraid to say so and to ask for it. And we get this. So humans get this. My problem is we don't take this knowledge of how we can act as humans into our work. So for example, the Kanban method, a lot of approaches sort of ignore the challenge of dealing with humans and try and come up with a structural approach because it can be a challenge to work with the human part. So let's use a structural approach. Let's put a work in process limit, a number at the top of the column. You can't have more than 5 things in development. And the logic here is it is the work in process limit that ultimately stimulates conversations about process problems. The team has the option to break the limit, ignore the problem and carry on, or face up to the issue, discuss it, and suggest a change. And so this is the advice, kind of. People might find it difficult to talk about things, but the limit will encourage it. And then I found this tweet. The working columns limit was 2. We had 3 items in it. I raised it to 3. There are now 4 items in it. So I don't mean to sort of say that structural advice can't help. Okay, structural advice can help. Doing shorter iterations makes it less threatening, I think, not achieve something. Actually, this is what, in the Scrum training course I did with Jeff Sutherland, he told this story about Ken Schwaber, where an organization had asked Ken to come in and describe Scrum to them. And at the end of the day, they said to Ken, do you think we should do our next project in Scrum? And Ken said, no way, just no way. There's no way that you've got the capability to do what you're planning in 18 months. My advice to you is to do waterfall and look for a new job in 15 months' time. And I love it. So this is inherent kind of, we know, like on the one hand, structural changes like small time boxes make it easier, because if I miss a week's commitment, that's much easier to recover from than saying I didn't deliver 18 months. Yet at the same time, I think in Ken's advice is this idea that it would be embarrassing or threatening to make it small and visible, and therefore you might like to act in a way that hides it or avoids dealing with the problem. And I'll show an example of how I used Scrum to deal with that, but how it was quite a challenge at the end of this talk. So I like to be a theory-driven practitioner. I like the idea of theories to explain things and to produce new kind of behaviors. Chris Idris comes up with this idea of a theory of action. He says that all humans want to achieve results. We want to be effective. We want to achieve outcomes. And in order to achieve the results that we intend, We basically look at a situation through a particular mindset, a particular set of values or beliefs we have about ourselves and others and what our goals are. And then we choose actions that will give us the results. And what's nice about this is this gives us a theory of learning. That his argument is learning happens in two scenarios. The first time you produce the results that you intended, you can say that you have learned. Okay? What can also happen is you can intend to produce a result but not produce it, and then you've got a choice about what do you change in order to get the result you wanted. And you can do that two ways. You could try a different action, or you could try a different look at the way you're framing it and your mindset and change that. Like, as an example, I work at BBC Worldwide. We have a portfolio meeting, and we had a stand-up meeting around a portfolio board, and it took 2 hours. So we didn't get the result we wanted. It shouldn't have been 2 hours. So there were two ways we could have done it. We could have said, gee, why is it taking 2 hours? What are the root causes? What are we spending our time talking about? Because we're all saying we're tired from standing for 2 hours. But our solution was to bring in chairs, which is a single loop solution, okay? We just change our action. We don't think, why did it take 2 hours to do this program level review? What's going on? We said, no, avoid all that, just bring in a chair to solve the discomfort. And so that's the idea of single loop learning. The chair is a single loop. It tries to achieve the same result just by changing your actions. The mindset would have been to go back and look at, like I've said, what's taking us so long. And what I like about this model too is that it's a very tough definition of learning. A lot of people will say, I've come to a conference and I learned something. And this model would say, no, you haven't. You might have insight and you may have awareness, but you haven't got learning until you go and implement it and achieve a result on the basis of that insight or awareness. And I really like that because people say, I've learned how to communicate more effectively. And it's like, no, you might have insight. Show me the conversation that you did more effectively and as a result of implementing it. Then I will give you that you've learned. Or the agile methods say they increase trust. Well, again, show me. What did you do to produce trust? What was the conversation that you had that produced trust? Now, that's all very interesting. That's a theory of double loop learning. What's more interesting is this gap that I've alluded to, that how we think we act and how we tell others we act aren't actually how we act. And I think this has important ramifications in terms of the effectiveness of our work. The best way of testing this claim is to videotape or audio record yourself. I did this with a client, so I'll work with clients and I'll say, like the call center, for training purposes, this session may be recorded. I'll ask them, I'll say, I would like to record my work with you for my own benefit. I might review this with a coach or transcribe it for my own learning. Are you comfortable with that? And some of them have said no, and that's fine. Some of them have said yes, and it's been very useful. The first time I did it, I realized I'd had this meeting that hadn't gone too well, but I couldn't work out why. So I thought, brilliant, I've got it on the audio recording. When I go back to the hotel tonight, I'll listen. And even though I was at the meeting, I knew I was recording it, I knew I wanted to learn, I didn't realize what I actually said. Because there's a certain point in the tape recording where you hear me come on and go, no, don't say it like that. Which if someone said to me, Benjamin, would you get in front of an audience and give them that as to tell them, Benjamin, effective agile coaching is if you don't like what someone said, yell at them. Tell them they're wrong for using those words. If you said to me, Benjamin, do you believe that's effective? I'm like, no. And would I tell others I acted like that? No. Did I act like that? Yes. Okay, and so this is this gap, and I was shocked. I was literally stunned that I could have acted in a way that I thought was ineffective. And the problem for me is, because I didn't know I was doing it, it didn't give me an opportunity to correct it. I was making an error, but I was unaware of it. This happens, in this very room, I did a workshop at another conference. And just to give you an example of this that I think illustrates this gap between how we think we act and tell others we act and how we actually act. The session was, I said, I'm a manager, there's someone on my team who's poorly performing. Here's what I said to him. Could you pretend that you're consultants or coach to me and help me out? Like, I want to learn how to be more effective at communicating negative evaluations to my staff. How did I do when I said these words? And someone in the audience said, Benjamin, your feedback to the team member was poor because it didn't focus on any positive actions and it didn't use any examples. I said, all right, well, let's stop and slow this down because I think you've communicated to me your theory of effective communication or feedback. I think you're saying good feedback has 2 points. It has examples and relates to things that are positive. Do you believe that? And the guy's like, yep. And then I said, well, what I'm puzzled about is I don't think your own advice is consistent with what you believe effective advice is. So let's test, though, your own feedback to me. How does it relate to your rules of effective feedback? Did it contain a positive action that I did? I don't think this does. There's no positive action there. Do you see that? I said to the guy, he said, yeah, I see that. And I said, well, okay, well, what about your second point of good feedback? Did it contain a specific example? It's like, no. And I said, so can you see how I think that you've acted completely consistently with your own idea of what effective feedback is? And he said, yeah, I can. And then I said, but did you design it like that? Because that would be quite a trick to have a statement that's completely self-contradictory. And he's like, no. And so this is an example of what I did, I think, when I yelled at someone ineffectively. I think we can all do this. And Idris calls this skilled incompetence. It's incompetent in the sense that it violates its own rules of effectiveness. Okay? You've got a view on how to be effective. You're exactly not effective, so it's incompetent. And it's skilled in the sense that he didn't have to think to produce that. It came skillfully, like turning left when you're driving a car. And also it illustrated the idea that it was skillfully unaware, that it hadn't been thought through with any awareness. And now that I sort of see this, it occurs to me a lot. There was a Kanban conference last year in America where a group of transformation consultants were looking at teams and trying to work out, were they helping them transform? And they wanted to help them transform to be more transparent as part of their work. So they came up with some behavioral measures that indicated transparency. And then in secret, stood at stand-ups with clipboards measuring each person on how transparent that person was. It didn't make sense to me. How could a group that valued transparency measure others' transparency in secret? We had the same thing at a conference in Scandinavia last week where a bunch of coaches were working with teams and they wanted to increase the amount of respect in the team. And they said that teams that respect and trust each other often talk about outside home life things at work. But they were worried that if they told people that they were measuring how much they mentioned their kids, for example, they might mention their kids, but because they knew they were being measured on it, rather than they wanted to share a story of their kids. And so they solved this dilemma that they were in by hiding the measures from people. And so the thing for me is basically they judged the people in the team to be, they said, we predict you would be inauthentic in your actions if we told you what we were measuring. But we're going to solve that by not telling you what we're measuring and not telling you we're not telling you. And then the thing for me is, how is that respectful to jump to a conclusion about, like, this is the theory. Once we get to a prediction about how someone else thinks or acts, like their intention or their motivation, and we don't test it with them, people find, humans will respond mostly quite defensively. Because if we map it to a legal situation, it's as if you've charged someone with a crime, had the court case, and then convicted them before you've even given them the evidence. So if I sort of say to you, I thought about having a conversation with you, but I thought you might become defensive, and so I didn't, you might in fact become defensive because you see yourself validly as someone open to influence. But the other person has basically made a prediction about you and convicted you in a legal sense. So we don't think this logic is fair in a court of law, but we do apply it a lot in our own thinking. And I think that leads to less effective outcomes. So I wanted to come back again to how the advice does it. So one thing is we know that humans can become defensive if they feel accused of acting in a certain way without presenting them the evidence for it. So what are some of the advices? Kanban is explicit. It just says Kanban tries to avoid emotional resistance. So this is some of the stuff that David's written. We must drive out fear in order to facilitate future change. By agreeing to respect current roles, responsibilities, and job titles, we eliminate initial fears. This should enable us to gain broader support for our Kanban initiative. And there's a couple of things that, for me, I think are inconsistent about this advice. One is, because I'm afraid that you'll become afraid, I need to get you to agree that we don't change the job titles. So on the one hand, I think if you're feeling afraid you'd be ineffective and this wouldn't work, this initiative would fail. But on the other hand, I'm feeling afraid at the moment. So it doesn't make sense to me. I'm experiencing conditions I think if you experience, you'd become ineffective. I don't understand why that is. And my major thing with this is, can I tell you what I'm doing? If I'm working with you using the Kanban method, can I say that I'm trying to agree with you your current roles and responsibilities will be respected in order that you not feel afraid? And I don't think you can always do that. I think if I'm saying I'm trying to get you to agree so that you don't feel afraid, that might create fear, which is the thing that you want to avoid. And so therefore, what people often do is hide what they're doing and not say so. The challenge to me is if I'm hiding my intent, that seems deceptive. And how does acting in a deceptive way create this high trust culture that Kanban claims to be able to create? What people often do, often people try and bypass and avoid things. The other thing they do is they try and control but not openly. So they'll ask leading questions that hide their view, that try and get you to come up with it. So this is a made-up conversation on someone's blog. I'll just choose a couple of them. The team says, Coach, this agile process stuff you sold us doesn't work. And the coach says, did you build working software regularly? The team, no, it was too difficult. Did you extend your definition of done as far as you could? No, it was too difficult. Then down here, so the coach says, you're absolutely sure it was the agile process that caused you to fail? Oh yes, absolutely. So it's this coaching style where it's like, I'm not going to order you about directly, but I am going to ask you questions hoping that you'll work out what I think the right answer is without me needing to tell you directly. Like, I think it's fairly clear here that the coach thinks they didn't achieve the outcomes he promised because they didn't do the work, but he doesn't say so directly. And so at the end, what happens is people just walk away feeling bewildered. What was the coach on about? He didn't help at all. So people are often controlling, explicitly or implicitly. They often try and avoid emotion, and then in the way they act, they often avoid stating their views directly and use questions to lead people instead. So what's a more effective approach? How have I found? I want to rush through some techniques that I've found have been more helpful to me that avoid some of these problems. The first thing is changing the way we tend to look at someone, especially in a challenging situation. We tend to look at others, we tend to think that we know the right answer because we ask ourselves, how confident do we feel about our answer? And we're wired in a way to come back and say, yes, very confident most of the time. We see the other person as uninformed or ill-intentioned, and if they don't agree with us, they might have questionable motives. So our goal is to get them to see things my way. One of the talks this morning was, how do I convince others to change? An altered frame is to say, I have some information but might not see or understand everything. The other person might see things that could help, and they're probably acting with integrity if I understood more about the scenario they see. So our job is to combine knowledge to make the best choice. And this goes along with, we talked about that mindset, actions, results. To be more effective, we have to change not just what we do, but the thinking, that frame that we bring into the conversation. So we're trying to get publicly testable information. So if you think Jeff is making ineffective decisions or the team has given too much responsibility, say so in a way that the team could recognize and it didn't rely on you just thinking to yourself, so that you and they could come up with a free and informed choice that they're likely to feel internal commitment towards. They'll do it because they want to. And then you need to do things like test your assumptions and inferences and share all relevant information, including hunches. So if you think, I think you've self-organized in an ineffective way, here's what I saw that led me to that. What do you think? That's an example of sharing all relevant information. So some things I've done with teams that have helped is to make the undiscussable discussable. I've had teams where they felt that the meeting was running on too long, but they felt unable to say so because they might offend someone. So we talked about that problem in a retrospective and agreed that we'd use a two-hand rule. If you thought someone was speaking too long or the conversation was going off topic in a stand-up, you raise your hand. If someone else in the team also raised their hand, it was sort of a social vote, then it was an agreement to stop the discussion and move it to the end of the conversation, the end of the stand-up. The thing I love about this is when I introduced it most recently, I thought, again, I see everything, I'm right, back in that sort of controlling frame. And two of my team had to actually tell me that they had their hands up because I was so engaged with arguing with someone. I was literally blind to the hands, which demonstrated fallibility in learning, which I think is a useful thing in terms of showing that you're open to learning and increasing the team's trust. Make it easy for people to tell you the problems that they're having. A question I really love at the end of stand-up is to ask what wasted your time. And the rule is you just tell me whatever you think wasted your time, however you want to define that, and how long it took. The advantage there was we could sort of map it out and graph it. The team I worked with, we had desktop PCs were the most commented things in 3 months. And what was useful to me is I feel a bit ashamed to say this amongst technical people, but I thought the developers were just whinging because I asked myself, have I ever heard anyone say that machine's too quick? Never. So I thought, I don't care that your problem, everyone would tell me their machine's slow, but then we started measuring it and everyone did indeed tell us that their machine was slow. So we did a lovely experiment to get one new machine and prove that it was bigger. The joke at the end of this, though, was that that did convince management to allow us to buy faster PCs, but they said, why didn't you just ask for them? And I realized I'd made an assumption that I wasn't allowed to just ask for faster PCs. So I would have done better if I'd known about my assumption and checked it. The other thing is to use the visual information to get clearer about people having different mindsets on a problem. This is a team I worked with, and most of the board is off to the right here. This was just near go live. We tried to get an earlier go live to clients. We couldn't get it shorter than about 6 months. When we went live, we generated a lot of information. A lot of information. This had all come in a week. And you see, we had so much that we actually blocked the fire alarm button. It's like someone had vomited index cards on a wall. The team said to me that they were feeling depressed, and I couldn't understand why, because I came in and I'd look at the right-hand side and I'd say, have we done any work? What's finished? And loads of work was being finished. Then I'd look back and say, what's waiting for test? What's in code review? What's waiting for dev? And that was all pretty well constrained. We had one person on each thing or a pair of people. And so it didn't bother me that stuff was to the left. But it was useful that their view was more of a Scrum thing, that they said, well, we come in the morning and we look at our column, which is an interesting way of framing it. We look at our column and then to the left of it, and if it was empty, we feel good, and if it's got stuff in it, we feel bad. So they viewed all this as badness, and it was just interesting. I didn't at all. I was like, what have we got finished? There'll always be stuff arriving. But what was interesting was we negotiated, and they challenged what was the value of having it up there if we weren't going to start it, so we decided to clear it down, and in the end, it went better. So visualization is a good way of testing different mindsets. Right, I've got 5 minutes and I want to introduce one practical idea to take away. One thing that can be useful is to realize that when we see things, this is a model from Idris called the ladder of inference. And let's map it back to the Mike Cohen situation with the team member who was over dominant. So what happens in the world is there's a lot of information that we could select, and some of it we could just describe. And the key thing at the describe layer is that you can explain what's going on in a way that another person watching a video could come to a similar conclusion. So the thing is, we have to do more than that. We have to come up with explanations and evaluations and propose actions, but all of these things are often assumptions about how others are acting that are very useful to us, but sometimes they can be wrong. And what we often don't understand is how quickly we leap up the ladder. So in that situation, Mike gave an example where he said that the team had allowed Jeff to make all the decisions, which was ineffective. So he was probably seeing the team make decisions. You know, he might have said at stand-up, Jeff took on board Jeff said, I will work on 3 cards. That's the description. You could watch a video and see whether that happened or not. But he would say that then Jeff has become over-controlling, and there's an evaluation implicit in that would be ineffective. So the thing is not that that's wrong, but to go all the way up your ladder without testing publicly what you saw and the rung that you get to can lead to misunderstandings. So you can see things and come to the wrong conclusion. And in that Mike Cohen example, he got to the point of proposing an action, put an architect in the team, without actually checking any of the intermediate steps between what he saw and the conclusion that he came to with anybody else. And I think that's a condition that's anti-learning. It's designed to avoid learning. How's he going to find out that he was wrong? And the other thing is it can create misunderstandings and conflicts. Often you'll find people jump from selecting and describing stuff into explanation and evaluation and proposing actions, and people just trade actions. We should do unit testing. No, we should get another tester. We should do unit testing. And they're not mapping the rungs on their ladder. So this is a very useful tool for understanding for diagnosing how other people are seeing or acting, and also for acting yourself. So just as an example, I'll use a scenario. This is a team that I coached, and this isn't a particular true scenario, but I've worked with other teams where they said, our manager is a control freak. And the problem for me is control freak on the ladder is up at the explanation and evaluation, that the guy's deliberately being controlling, and that's ineffective. And the challenge is he might not see himself like that or be aware that he's acting that way. So if you jump up the ladder without saying what you've seen, people will feel defensive because they'll feel unfairly judged and accused. So in this case, what I would model instead using the ladder is to say what you see. So I did this with this guy. I said, look, in the stand-up, I noticed the way that the team was standing, and I wanted to share some thoughts I had about what was going on and see how you saw it. And he said, yeah, cool, go for it. And then I said, well, you were standing in front of the board in a way that I thought meant the other people couldn't see what was on the board. It therefore led me to think, how do they know what they're going to work on or what you're talking about if they can't actually see it? And you know, I can imagine that they might think that they're not as involved as you are. So I can kind of say that I want to test whether you're being over-controlling, but in a way that allows him to see the evidence and challenge it at each point. And he said, oh yeah, I didn't even realize I was doing it. It's there because there wasn't a better spot to put it. We're able to solve it. But the thing was, by going through the ladder, I was able to say things that if you said directly might be offensive, but do so in a way that gives them the evidence and allows you to check at each point. So I guess the thesis of this talk is that we know that humans can act in these defensive ways, that there can be this gap between how we say we act and how we actually act, and I think that's important in terms of the effectiveness of the results that we create. I'd encourage you to have a look at that and to see whether you see that in your own behavior and whether knowing that could help you design more effective behavior. I would encourage you to challenge the advice that you get at these conferences and make it explicit, like go down the ladder. When people say create trust, what would I do or say? Go back down the ladder. What would a video recorder show me doing or saying to produce, like this afternoon we might get an opportunity with David. If I want to change your self-image and alter the social fabric of the organization, what does that look like at the description level on the ladder? What would I see someone do or say? Because I do want to, maybe I might, I'm not sure, I don't know what it means, but let's say I did know what it meant and I liked it. I want to produce it. What do I do or say? So challenge the advice that you read to see examples that indicate what you do or say. And then use the ladder of inference to diagnose how you're acting and others are acting. And the best thing is that it's not only a diagnosis tool, but it also helps you understand how you could say things more effectively. Like, basically say what you see, say what you think it means, and check with others at both points how they view things. And I hope that that's been persuasive and you're intrigued and interested in that, because my belief is if we can act more congruently with how we say we act and design ways of testing what we see and what we think it means, it leads to outcomes that are better learning on your side and the other side, and I believe more effective results. So with that, I think I'm bang on time. Have I got time for one question? Yep, Chris? An example of advice that doesn't do that, or? Yeah, well, to me, the last one is me trying to be practical. I'm saying use the ladder of inference. So if you see something that concerns you, like a team being ineffective, say what you see, say what you think it means, and check with others how they view it. Is that I mean, it is necessarily abstract. It's 3 bullet points on a slide. Is your challenge to me to say, Benjamin, you're being incongruent with your own advice? Well, I could turn it around. Is there a scenario that I could apply it to that you'd find helpful?
Yeah, I would say it was a little unwanted. Maybe recap on your earlier.
I think so. The best example I've seen is that Scrum says make things visible and then it's discussable. The challenge for me was I worked with a team recently where they had agreed before I'd started to deliver 280 points of work. We'd done 3 fortnights. We were meant to do 11 fortnights. After 3 fortnights, it was clear that we weren't going to do what we said we would. And I said, I think we should say what we see and what we think it means. And it was so funny. The vendor said, no way. And I'm like, but we said we'd use Scrum and be transparent. What are your concerns? And the concern was that everyone was worried we would look incompetent. And I just don't know how we can hide that. And the client eventually said, when we said to them, what does this mean about your estimations? And I said, clearly it means that what we predicted wasn't very close at all to what we were. They were quite incompetent as predictions, or they were predictions, depending on how you view what an estimate is. And they were very upset to hear it. They're very upset, and they tried to give us they contributed lots of advice about how we could be more effective. And we talked through that and said whether we could use it or not. And in the end, I said, look, we're not enjoying telling you this. We're very upset too with the scenario that we're in, but we're telling you this so that we can deliver the maximum amount of stuff in Sprint 11. And we want to tell you today so that we can have a conversation about what's most important, because we will build something. We believe we'll get about 100 units of stuff done, but just not the 280. That turned out to be extremely effective, but it meant pushing back on two groups' concerns about being transparent and how it might look negatively towards us. The thing now is that the clients have actually said they love Agile because they think this always happens in Agile. And I was just surprised because I thought it actually took an enormous amount of skill and challenge to be that transparent, especially in a situation where we were underperforming against what we'd hoped. Does that help in terms of an example? Yeah? Yep. Yep, okay. All right, so I'll be around for the rest of the day. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you disagreed, if you were violent in your disagreement, that would even be interesting. Or if you'd like to talk about it more, please come up and chat. Thanks very much.